You're tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the U.S. and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day, content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward. This season, Rights at the Crossroads unpacks the intersections of reproductive rights and gender justice in today's America. In recent episodes, we've explored abortion as a fundamental healthcare issue, setting the stage for today's critical discussion, the concept of personhood. This concept is central to ethical, legal, and personal debates, profoundly influencing perspectives on abortion, reproductive rights, and human rights. The question of when personhood begins is pivotal. Anti-abortion advocates argue that personhood starts at conception, asserting that embryos and fetuses should have the same rights as individuals after birth. This perspective has led to the introduction of fetal personhood laws in various states, aiming to grant legal rights from the moment of fertilization. Conversely, abortion rights supporters typically contend that personhood is established at birth, emphasizing the autonomy and rights of the pregnant individual up until that point. They argue that granting personhood before birth infringes on the rights of those who are pregnant. In this episode, we'll delve into these contrasting viewpoints, examining how definitions of personhood impact laws, personal beliefs about abortion, and the broader implications for human rights. Let's dive in. Ari, I feel like people don't know the difference between being alive and being a person. Like, I expect more people to know that difference, and they don't. Does that surprise you?
Does it surprise me that you expect people to be smarter than they are? No. That's a very you thing.
Okay. Yeah, I do try to expect the best from people, but I'm disappointed a lot.
Unfortunate condition of living in America.
Yeah, although I don't blame people for not sitting down to think about this a lot. Like, I think when you explain it, people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But if you just ask off the cuff, it's not as clear.
Yeast is alive.
Right.
Yogurt is alive.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make them person.
Right.
Bugs are alive. Animals are alive. It's very odd to me when people will have these conversations about abortion or ethics and be like, well, if you can kill it, that's murder. And it's like, well, that's not quite what we're talking about, though.
Like, you can kill a lot of things that aren't a person. You can kill my hopes and dreams.
Yeah, in fact, actually, Republicans believe you can kill women too, and that doesn't count.
Right. So those two things do not go hand in hand. Also, people don't understand the difference between being human and being a person, because you can have human attributes and still not be a person, right?
So this part I kind of understand if people struggle with, right? Because it's not, like you said, it's not something that the average person is spending a lot of time thinking about. But to provide an example, if you cut your hair, if you go get a haircut, the hair that now falls off of you is human, and it will continue to remain human.
Mm-hmm.
If you cut your nails, the nails that have now left you are human.
They're human nails, they're human hair.
Yeah, but that doesn't make those things people.
Right.
Personhood does that. And personhood, it's a legal category that assigns someone agency, autonomy, like self-actualization.
Mm-hmm.
And in the US, that translates to the rights and protections that that person has. Ironically, in the US, corporations qualify for personhood.
That is crazy, and probably a whole nother episode. So in summary, bacteria is not a person, and fingernails are not a person.
Yeah.
And yet the personhood argument is used all the time to substantiate rights for embryos and fetuses before birth.
Yeah. And if I could be crystal clear about what you just said, to make the connection between those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hair is made out of human cells.
Mm-hmm.
Nails are made out of human cells. An embryo is made out of human cells. None of those things are people until they're assigned personhood. And assigning a thing personhood has massive implications legally, ethically, philosophically, and somehow we don't ever seem to consider the steps to 2000 of assigning something personhood because we're just so concerned with like step one, everything is a person, except the women. Obviously, the women are not.
No, the women are never people.
Yeah.
We are just birthing machines.
Yeah. In classic Georgia fashion, we go directly to the southern half of the country to see where this concept of like personhood for embryos first originated.
Oh, yeah, right? Because it started in Georgia.
Yeah, in 2019, actually, before I think anyone who isn't in our field was even bothering to think about abortion on a daily basis. Brian Kemp was like, listen, hold my beer while I show you how this shit is done.
Wait, who's Brian Kemp?
The governor of Georgia. And
Satan incarnate.
Exactly. And he was the very first state governor to propose an abortion ban, right? Georgia's 6-week ban set the legal precedent for all of the other bans that we see today.
And he is a white Christian male. Shocker.
Yeah.
That bases a lot of his governorship in his Christian faith.
And decided as part of that ban that embryos were going to have personhood, which, you know, begged several additional questions. Like, for example, if you're telling me that embryo is a person starting at conception, does that mean that after 10 months of pregnancy, when that fetus is actually born as a baby, it is actually already 10 months old and its birthday is 2 months later?
Oh, yeah. When do we celebrate birthdays?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, that's like the least of the problems. But yeah, it's like, why aren't we answering these intense questions?
Well, like, okay, so if you're pregnant, can you drive in the HOV lane? Because you're two people.
Yeah. If you are pregnant and you commit a crime, you shouldn't be able to go to prison because there's another person inside you who has nothing to do with
was that person your accomplice and
right,
then the fetus is also charged?
Or could you claim that you were actually operating under the Imperious curse because pregnancy is actually mucks with your brain, and the person inside you, which is this embryo, is the one orchestrating this entire crime that you committed? You know, I mean, like, obviously I'm being facetious. The point is that this whole situation is so crazy that actually seems like a legitimate question to ask.
What's funny, and I say that sarcastically, is that Brian Kemp did not consider the answer to any of these questions before he passed the fetal personhood bill.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up because he was directly asked by a reporter, like, what about the implications? And she listed some. And the GOP's response in Georgia was, oh, we're not too worried about it. Like, they actually said that they had not bothered to consider any of the implications because they knew that no one from their party would ever ask those questions. I'm not making this up. There is an actual proof of this quote in several news articles that came out around that time. And, you know, it's like, we've just mentioned some of them. There's so many. There's tax implications. There's multiple like property implications, legal implications. Like, if someone is not an American citizen and they get pregnant, they can't be deported anymore, you know, because they now have an American person inside them. And if we actually just put the jokes aside, though, realistically, what we are doing by assigning embryos personhood is sacrificing the personhood of the person carrying them. And I can't say
who is arguably a real person, right?
But I mean, it's a woman, so no. You know, but my point is that like it's amazing because we have actually reached a point in the US where we have normalized this concept where once a woman gets pregnant, she is less of a person than she was like the day before she got pregnant.
Because the fetus is granted more rights in a lot of medical or just life cases than she will be.
Yeah. And the shitty part about this is that when you try and talk to the anti-choice, the forced birth crowd about this, you know, we get called like dramatic in our comments. We get called, we get told that we're like making up scenarios that don't exist. And it's like, oh, no, you're just completely ignorant to what's happening across this country. Like Georgia might have started it, but we have reached the point where multiple states have now adopted this concept. Most recently, South Carolina, but before that, Oklahoma, Idaho, Arkansas, Alabama. Like one of the big things that happened in 2024 was that the country rallied around this concept of IVF in Alabama. And the reason why any of that went down was because the Alabama State Supreme Court, like a bunch of dum-dums, was like, oh yeah, an embryo is a person, and therefore you can't do IVF because you're restoring people in test tubes. And I'm like, you know, anyone with basic common sense will tell you that the difference between a person and an embryo is that one of them can be stored in minus 80 degrees and the other cannot. Like,
right. You can't put a baby in a freezer and expect it to survive.
Right.
The funniest thing about that example was that the Alabama courts got ahead of Republican politicians, and the Republican Party had not prepared the talking points that they needed to explain that court decision. Do you remember the chaos around this? When Tommy Tuberville was asked about it and he was like, oh yeah, I fully support it. And then people were like, really? Because now IVF can't happen. He was like, oh, I actually haven't read it. And he had to like walk back that he hadn't read the court decision. This court just went totally rogue, like the Supreme Court in Alabama. And then the governor of Alabama had to pass legislation to protect IVF because people got so pissed and Republicans couldn't explain how IVF wasn't going to be threatened by the court's decision.
It was a super comical 24 hours.
It was hilarious.
Nobody knew what to say.
Right.
And they had, for one of the first times, riled up their own base.
Yeah.
Because their own base of white Christian women was like, what do you mean we can't have access to IVF?
Oh, so much of the Republican strategy is figuring out how to spin the evil policies that they want to make in a way that's palatable for their constituents. And they weren't able to take the time to strategize the talking points in this case. So their constituents just saw what they were doing.
Yeah. It's too bad that their constituents didn't stick to their guns, though, because for some reason, it was okay to not label embryos as people when it came to IVF, but when it came to abortion, they were like, no, these embryos are still people. So, you know, the hypocrisy continues.
Yeah.
But I remember just being very amused during those 24 hours because I was like, oh, this party is falling apart. And there was this extra like fun bit of how the judge in the Alabama State Supreme Court case had used the word God in his verdict 44 times.
Oh, yeah. And we were like, separation of church and state, huh?
And then, he was like, wait, what's that? And it's like, people were like, didn't you go to law school in order to be here? So, but yeah, this is, you know, we're joking about it, but the truth is that like the real world implications of all of this are women are losing access to care and their autonomy and their personhood across the country.
No, I said it was hilarious before, but like for us to watch as public health professionals who saw it coming, but it was actually quite devastating for women and families that were going through the IVF process in Alabama and didn't have access to their own bodily products, and then also weren't allowed to transfer them out of state because that would have been considered child trafficking.
I have to say, you know, the lengths to which the GOP goes to find narratives that work for the insane policies that they're trying to pass is honestly impressive. Like I almost gotta give them kudos for the level of stuff that they just managed to make up along the way.
It really shows that they understand the kind of literacy level of their voters, where they think that they can just scoot by on reframing, rewording things, and oftentimes it works, right? So this is like a little off topic, but humor me. they are pursuing a national abortion ban. But they know from public polling that the word ban is unacceptable to the majority of Americans. The majority of Americans think that abortion should be allowed in some or all circumstances. And so they're reframing the entire conversation in terms of national minimum standards because they feel that their voters would be more supportive of this concept of minimum standards than they would ban, this scary word ban.
I mean, that's a perfect metaphor for everything they do. Like following the absolute debacle in Alabama, they as in the GOP, made IVF their platform. And it's like, you guys are the ones who caused this problem in the first place.
And like Trump came out shortly after that and made a statement that he's the father of IVF. Do you remember that?
Yeah. And I'm like, do you even know what IVF stands for? Like, Carrie Lake from Alabama was calling it UVF the whole time in her debate. So I'm like, you guys are just a bunch of idiots.
I'm surprised she didn't call it UFO.
But this is like classic Republican strategy, right? And unfortunately, it works. After the debacle in Alabama, the Democratic Senate put forth an IVF protection bill, which the Republicans voted against immediately. And then they put forward their own bill. They named it the exact same thing, Right to IVF Act. And they only voted for that one because they wanted to call it a Republican bill as opposed to a Democratic one. But of course, they put in a whole bunch of language that was like anti-choice and anti-woman and anti-trans folks. So it was voted down. And then they spent like months being like, oh my God, we tried to pass this IVF bill and it didn't work, while totally ignoring the fact that they voted against the original Right to IVF Act.
Right. And then use the same language that Democrats use because that is the acceptable language in society today.
Yeah. It's their classic MO. They're really starting to take what other people have said and like turn it into what works for them.
Like my body, my choice.
Yeah.
They co-opted that for the anti-vax movement and still use it today.
Yeah. And if you think that being in the IVF space would have taught them a lesson, but instead now their South Carolina Republicans are trying to pass personhood bills starting at fertilization, right? So they're simultaneously trying to have the death penalty for women who get abortions and also giving embryos personhood fertilization.
Yeah, tell me about that and what the implications are for birth control. Because I think people don't think about that connection between if it starts at fertilization, then what does that mean for birth control as quote unquote abortive fashions?
Absolutely. So currently, South Carolina Republicans have republished a bill that is seeking to establish personhood at fertilization, and secondly, establish abortion as homicide. Now, the reason why that's important is because South Carolina is a death penalty state, which means that if you are charged with homicide, you are now eligible to receive the death penalty. That in itself is like extremely horrible and crazy, especially for a group that calls themselves pro-life. Like the irony and hypocrisy never ceases to exist, right?
Okay, you're saying that in South Carolina, they're proposing that if a woman has an abortion, that she can be charged with murder, punishable by the death penalty.
Yes.
But they call themselves pro-life.
But let's take it a step further, okay? They're also establishing personhood at fertilization, which opens the door for them to classify any birth control as homicide because birth control prevents fertilization. So they are also saying that if this bill passes, that we could label the use of birth control as homicide, which would say that you are now eligible for the death penalty simply for using birth control. And this is the thing, when I talk about this online, like, this is written in a bill. It is available for the public to access and see. I'm not making this up. And yet, anti-choice forced birth crowd comes into our comments and does their classic thing where they're just like, no, you're a liar. And I'm just like, for the love of all that is holy.
They do that every time we talk about Republicans coming after birth control next, even though they have already taken clearer steps than even the example that you just gave to do that. They also did it when you posted the role play about trying to leave the state of Texas as a pregnant person.
Yeah.
And the role play was that a cop stopped you at the border and made you turn around because he suspected that you were leaving the state for an abortion. And people were like, this is so dramatic. It would never happen. And then Idaho passed a state law that makes it illegal to take minors across state lines to have an abortion. And they're calling it abortion trafficking.
Exactly. And I didn't randomly post that role play. I posted it the day that Senate Republicans shot down a bill to protect state travel for pregnant people. So, like, there's actual proof that they're doing this.
That would require them to read the news, Pari.
Yeah, but Eve, I put it in the post. So, like they're watching this post, they're arguing with me that I'm wrong. And it's like, here's a screenshot of the actual bill that your Republican reps like voted down today. And this is, I want to point out that the part about this that is extra frustrating is not necessarily that they're disagreeing with us, because that's just what they do. It's the fact that they are, in their disagreement, acknowledging how bad this would be if it was real, right? Because they're like, no, that would never happen. You're so dramatic. You're making things up. And it's like, oh, so you are admitting that if this were true, it would be an insane thing for someone to do. And yet they don't seem to make that connection.
Well, they'd have to believe that the end game of their Republican representatives is malicious, and they will never believe that because they're good Christians.
Oh, well, that was much kinder than what I was about to say.
Well, I was going to say because their representatives are good Christians, so they believe what their good Christian representatives think and say.
Yeah.
Because why would a good Christian ever do something malicious?
Why would a good Christian ever do something that Jesus wouldn't do? For example, voting or advocating against warming centers for the homeless, believing that women shouldn't have access to health care, or believing that the poor and immigrants should be turned away from services. They never do any of these things.
Wow.
Yeah.
I actually thought that question would charge you up a lot quicker than it just did.
Mental gymnastics of this crowd. I mean, they must just be exhausted all the time because of how much their brains are working out to handle the kind of hypocrisy that they just bring to every situation that they're in.
Yeah, and I do have to caveat this by saying that we shit on Christianity a lot in our posts. I don't believe that all Christians are bad. I think that Christianity is weaponized against women, specifically against reproductive health. There's a number of good people out there who are pro-choice that understand that women should have rights and also identify as Christian. But
Christianity is not the problem.
Yeah.
At all. Christian nationalist extremism.
That's
the problem.
Yes.
And the weaponization of Christianity by the Republican Party in this country is a huge fucking problem.
Right. And that's pretty much the essence of the fetal personhood argument, right? Because all of the discussion around when does life begin is prompted and fired up by what people read and how they interpret in the Bible.
Yeah, which is hilarious because the Bible does not mention abortion at all.
It also doesn't apply to me. Why do I need to live my life by the Bible?
Excellent question, Eve. Because you're going to hell if you don't.
Well, guess what? That's my problem. And I don't know why God-fearing Christians care about what happens to me in the afterlife. Leave me alone.
It's so funny to me when they're like, you are going to hell and God will judge you. I was like, I literally just explained to you that I don't subscribe to any of this. So why do you think that would scare me? And a God that does even 1% of the things that you say that your God does is not a God, you know?
And what gets me the most when we talk about weaponized Christianity and Jesus followers is that, you know what's one thing that Jesus didn't do is treat women poorly. He had compassion for women. He appreciated and respected women through these biblical stories, right? And so how did we get to this point in time where some of the biggest Jesus fanatics in America think that it's okay to treat women in a way that Jesus absolutely would not.
Yeah, I mean, it's propaganda, right? It
Yeah.
also just makes you think about, it makes me think about like deeply Christian families, like the Duggar family, for example. You know, they were like
Oh,
on TV for decades
yeah.
talking about their Christian values and like really emphasizing the family bits and all of the traditional conservatism that they would promote
Mm-hmm.
and how anti-abortion they were
And
for decades and decades and decades.
and then their documentary came out.
Yeah, shiny happy people. And all of a sudden, when it surfaces that one of their daughters had an abortion because she needed it to save her life, except they conveniently decided that they weren't going to call it an abortion. They called it a physician assisted induced miscarriage. I'm like, girl, that's an abortion. Like,
Yeah.
everybody knows that. And so, but this is exactly Christian propaganda and the Christian extremist nationalism. It only applies when people want it to apply. And they take these like situations of exceptionalism and say, like, well, okay for me, but not for thee. And ultimately, the people who suffer because of that are women all around the country, right? Not just Christians, but of every faith and of every color. We're seeing it happen across the board. But imagine that you are a woman, and the day you get pregnant, you are less of a person than you were the day before.
Okay, so explain that to me like I'm a high schooler. What do you mean how that women are worth less?
I'm saying like women's personhood is worth less. Like the day before you got pregnant, you could choose what you wanted to do with every aspect of your life,
Mm-hmm.
your mental health, your emotional health, your physical health, all of it. Then you get pregnant and you're not allowed to make any decisions for yourself
Mm-hmm.
because there's a thing inside you that some random GOP senator has decided is a person and now has more rights than you do.
Mm-hmm.
And what I knew this before I got pregnant myself, but now that I've done it, pregnancy is an absolute shit show. Okay, it is. You are running a marathon every day. There is a being, a parasite inside you that is using every aspect of you to the point where you are only getting leftovers. And we have somehow normalized a society that says to pregnant women, "Oh, we don't give a fuck about you." Like, and also we actually are not going to give a single fuck about your fetus once it's born. But
Mm-hmm.
until then, it is the most important thing on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And it translates to women not being able to receive care in hospital rooms, being denied access to basic human rights, being denied access to basic health care, and dying in hospital rooms. And then the GOP response to that, instead of fixing the issue by acknowledging that an embryo is not a goddamn person, is instead just to bury the data. Like they're saying, okay, we realized or we've seen that women are dying as a result of this. So we're just not going to look at it anymore and not going to track it anymore. Instead of saying that women are people and are very much deserving of all of the care that they should be getting. And in fact, pregnant women should actually be treated better than we treat average people. Instead, it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if they tracked all the data on deaths and such, that would hurt the branding, right?
Obviously, yeah.
It's crazy to me. What they can't hide is that the birth rate in the US is like plummeting right now. And so that's part of the reason it's like this negative feedback loop where they're trying to build a forced birth workforce. But in doing so, in not allowing women the health care that they need, in delaying care for pregnant women in order to better protect, quote unquote, the life of the fetus.
They're sacrificing the personhood of the women themselves.
Yeah, they're discouraging women from getting pregnant. So women just aren't getting pregnant now. So they don't have the option of forcing women to give birth because women are just joining the 4B movement, or they're just like, I only want to have one kid. I'm not having two because I live in Texas. And if I get pregnant again, I might die if anything goes wrong.
Which is really wild because there's actually a very well established global formula for how you can encourage people to increase your fertility rate.
Is it giving women appropriate health care?
Yes, and it's creating a fair and just society, and it's creating social welfare programs and providing childcare and doing maternity leave. And it's like, instead of doing all that, the US is like, no, we're just going to go become an autocracy because that's easier for us to manage and much more our MO. And we just love controlling people.
It's interesting that all of the things that you listed are part of the Democratic platform, and yet Republicans have somehow branded these as problematic to American society.
Do you remember that post I did earlier this year about paid maternity leave?
Yes.
Okay, so I very naively
It was a
thought,
work of art. It was a work of art.
but I like so naively thought that people would not argue with that because like we are in a society where, generally speaking, society values families and values babies and the perpetuation of the human race or whatever. And I was making the point, the very objectively data supported point that if you provide paid maternity leave to women, you would be encouraging them to have and raise families. And the number of men that came into my comments and were like, it is not my responsibility to pay for your choices. And it's like, what is your responsibility? Like, because
I mean, the irony of it is that a lot of them cited the fact that it's not fair because they don't get paid paternity leave. And I'm like, Chad, you have precisely nailed why the patriarchy is harmful to men also. Please
exactly.
go sit with that for a minute.
Also, Hari and Eve didn't come up with the concept of paid maternity leave. Like the United Nations did, the Geneva Convention of Human Rights did. Like it's a standard measure of development for a country. I'm not saying this based on my own biases. And these damn Americans are all up in our comments like, we are not need, we don't need this. I'm like, we do. Our society is failing. We are failing women. We are the only developed country in the world that does not have paid maternity leave. And instead of remedying that, we're actually making women suffer and die during pregnancy potentially and removing their personhood while we're at it. Mm-hmm. So what incentive are you providing at any point, not just for women to get pregnant, but for women to even like want to have sex anymore? Like mm-hmm. Truly, why would we put ourselves in that risky a situation in a country that does not give a singular fuck whether we live or die?
Step 1, consider women people.
Step 2, don't consider embryos people.
Okay, so to summarize, let me give you a bit of a quiz. Is bacteria a person?
No.
Okay. Are peanuts a person?
No.
Okay. Is my fingernail a person?
No.
Okay. What about yeast?
Oh my God, let me think about that one. That's confusing. Obviously not.
And me as a woman, am I a person?
Yes. Depends who you ask, though.
Okay. And is your fetus that's inside your belly right now a person?
In my humble opinion, hell no.
Nope. It is not. Understanding the concept of personhood is fundamental to the ongoing debates surrounding reproductive rights and human dignity. By examining the ethical, legal, and personal perspectives, we can engage in more informed and empathetic discussions about these critical issues. As we conclude our series of pre-recorded episodes, we're excited to announce that starting in the coming weeks, Women in America will transition to weekly episodes addressing timely and relevant issues in reproductive health and rights. This shift will allow us to engage more dynamically with current events and provide you with up-to-date information and insights. Join us next time as we delve into the latest developments impacting reproductive health and rights, exploring how they affect individuals and communities nationwide. Your voice is vital in this ongoing conversation, and together we can navigate these challenging topics with insight and compassion. See you next time.